people, animals, and conservation science, all to fight extinction. My name is Brendan, and we're back here hanging out in our America's Pavilion to talk a little bit about one of our native species and how they cope with the cold weather that is going to come to us as we deal every year with winter. Now, that native species we're going to talk about today are snapping turtles. Now, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with snapping turtles, especially if you've been up around cottage country, if you have friends that have cottages. They're very, very commonly found around there oftentimes. They like to make their homes underneath your dock. But they do have to deal with winter, and they have a lot of ways that they will cope and evolve in order to deal with winter. So here right now, we have our 3 snapping turtles in our beaver habitat here at Toronto Zoo. The one that is slightly more mobile right now, that is Sparkles. The warm weather the last couple of days has raised the temperature of our pool here a couple of degrees, so she is a little bit more active than you'd expect her to be this time of year. But the one she's crawling all over is our male Minimus, and then just behind them there is our other female Glitter. Now, when you come visit us here at the Toronto Zoo, fingers crossed soon, you will notice that our snapping turtles are generally going to be found in the exact same spot all winter long. So we often get a lot of questions of how do they survive like this. They do stay submerged the entire time. They are underwater all winter, and they have some tremendous adaptations in order to do this. So snapping turtles, like all reptiles, are what are called ectotherms, or cold-blooded is the common term you'll hear. And all that means is that they get their body temperature from the surrounding environment. So as they're sitting in this pool, our pool today is sitting at about 5 degrees Celsius. That is the actual body temperature of all 3 of these snapping turtles now. They match their environment. And as long as they stay above the freezing level, so as long as they don't drop below 0, which if they're in liquid water, it's never going to be below 0, they can survive. Now what this means is they slow their body metabolism, their heart rate, their breathing, all of that slows right down. Normally you can expect a snapping turtle's heart to beat at about 40 beats per minute. When they are completely in hibernation or brumation as it's referred to in reptiles, they actually can potentially only beat once every 10 minutes or so. That is how slow their heart does go down to. But then you have the problem of breathing. So they don't have gills. They're not a fish or an aquatic amphibian that has the ability to breathe underwater at all times. So how do they solve this problem? So they actually have a really cool way of ensuring that they can breathe all winter long while they are submerged underwater. And this is what it's called, they vascularize their system. So what this means is they develop a bunch of new veins. And the area where the concentration of these veins is actually the greatest is in what's called their cloaca, which is the common opening in the back end for all of their waste, egg-laying in females, and that is how they breathe. The oxygen is absorbed through their skin. These veins are very much at the surface of the skin, so it's very easy for the oxygen to pass through that barrier and into their veins and be transported to their lungs. So basically, if you ever want to impress your friends at dinner, you can say, how do snapping turtles breathe underwater? They breathe through their butt. That is exactly how they do it. But then, there can be another problem if you're dealing with an environment like this over the winter, especially if it completely ices over. Turtles are not the only ones under there that are using up oxygen. You've got fish, you've got crustaceans, all kinds of other aquatic animals as well that are all competing for this limited resource, because if it's frozen over, you're not getting new oxygen coming into that water. So snapping turtles especially, as well as painted turtles here in Ontario, have an amazing thing that they can do. They can actually switch their bodies to a form of what's called anaerobic metabolism, or metabolism that doesn't need oxygen. So that is right, they don't even need oxygen to survive, and they can do this for up to 100 days. So if they're in a low oxygen body of water, for the first couple of months, they may be able to get some oxygen out of it. After that's over, they can still survive as their body then switches over to this different method of surviving. But this is a bit of a problem because anaerobic metabolism builds up lactic acid. So just like if you go for a run, you get a cramp, that's lactic acid in your muscles. That is not a very pleasant thing to have happen. And similar things happen with like heartburn. That's just the acid buildup, and that's why we get heartburn. So just like you or I might take a Tums in order to calm down some heartburn, calcium is the big thing that helps with that. Snapping turtles have an amazing thing too. They will use the calcium that is in their own shells to help to get some of that lactic acid out of their system and ease those cramps that they'll have over that time. Unfortunately though, a lot of this lactic acid buildup, this anaerobic metabolism, means that in the summertime or the springtime, when it starts warming up and they start coming out of the water, they can be very disoriented, very slow, very sluggish. And this is the beginning of that time that we have to be extra cautious with turtles, especially here in Ontario, because we have a lot of roadways that cut right through great turtle habitats. The first thing a snapping turtle like this is going to do in the spring is get out of that water, find a rock, sometimes the middle of a road, and just sit in the sun. As we said, they're ectotherms, they get their temperature from the environment. So they're going to sit in that sun and get as warm as possible and get that aerobic metabolism or oxygenated metabolism back into their systems. So what this means is oftentimes you're going to see a bunch of our turtles in the middle of roadways. They're just going to trying to get their body heat up, and then as the springtime turns into summertime, they're going to be trying to cross the roadways looking for good nesting sites. So we do want to make sure we are extra vigilant, extra cautious out there when, especially in the early springtime, keep an eye out for our turtles. And you might also notice here in our beaver habitat, we have some fish just behind me here as well. Those are our pumpkin seed sunfish. So this little kind of grouping here would be very similar to if you happen to go diving under a dock in cottage country right now. It's very cold. I do not recommend doing it. But you'll see fish kind of hanging out, very slow moving, not doing much. Turtles, maybe a little bit of motion like Sparkles is doing here, but more often you're going to be like Minimus and you're not going to move very much. Now, snapping turtles, when they do come out on land, I did do a video earlier in the year about how to help snapping turtles across the road, and fingers crossed I'll be able to do another one next spring because it's a very important skill to have. But it does become risky. Snapping turtles can get pretty snappy on land. They're pretty good in water. They don't really want to snap anything when they're underwater. They feel completely safe. But on land, they feel very vulnerable. And that actually has to do with how their shell is designed. So I actually have a snapping turtle shell here that we're going to take over here and show you why it is they're actually quite vulnerable. So first, I want to show this shell. So this is a shell of a Blanding's turtle, another native turtle species here in Ontario, actually part of our breeding and release programs here at the Toronto Zoo. So they've got a lovely dome shell. This is called their carapace, the top level. And then underneath, this is called their plastron. And this one's missing a piece, but it would actually come up to about here. So this is more your typical turtle that when it is frightened, it can retract its head and all of its limbs into its shell, basically close the shell up and feels completely safe. And that is what they will do. If they feel threatened, they retreat. Snapping turtles, though, you have this gigantic shell, the little skull here, that's always really cool. So this big shell, I always like showing the inside because you can see how their spine and their ribs are actually attached to their shell. So whenever you watch cartoons and you see a turtle go running out of its shell, that is physically impossible. They would be ripping their bones off. So it's an amazing adaptation that they're attached to that shell. So they've got all of this to try to protect, and this is their plastron, that undershell. Very small. It is impossible for them to completely retreat into their shell like any of the other turtles can. So snapping turtles have to do one thing that they do best, and that is defend themselves. So if you are helping a snapping turtle across the road, like I said, we do have a video up on our Facebook page that I did earlier in the summer about how to do that. They can get very snappy, but if you pay attention to how we did the technique, you're perfectly safe and out of the way of their head. So I always like to show this, especially when talking about turtles in the springtime. Now that being said, folks, that is about all I have to say today about snapping turtles over the winter. Do we have any questions?
Yeah. We've got, how do you tell Sparkles and Glitter apart?
How do you tell Sparkles and Glitter apart? That's a very good question, and actually very tricky for us here at the zoo. Sparkles here, if I can wipe our condensation away, you can see in the middle of her carapace, that top shell there, it is very smooth towards the back end. Glitter's carapace has a bit more ridges in the middle of it, but basically you just have to know these two turtles, and yet you can tell them apart.
Does this pool take its temperature from the ambient temp, or do you heat it?
Again, great question. So this pool is just as cold or as warm as the environment wants it to be. We have no heaters, we have no chillers on this pool, so right now, like I said, it's sitting at about 5 degrees Celsius. In the heat of the winter, it sits basically around the 1 degree mark.
Jackson, age 5, would like to know how old they are.
Excellent question, Jackson. Now, we actually do not know exactly how old these turtles are because they came to us as rescues. But all 3 of them have been with us here at the Toronto Zoo for over 20 years. So they are at least 20, probably 25 to 30. But snapping turtles in a zoo setting can live 40, 50 years. There have been reports of them living much longer than that, but the average is about 50.
And Jackson would also like to know, what are their favorite treats, and do you feed them in the winter?
Actually, that's a very great question, Jackson. So their favorite treats here at the zoo, they get fed mice, as well as smelt, which is a small type of fish, and some special gels that are made up for some of our animals here that contain all the vitamins and minerals that they need. I would say mice would be their favorite food here at the Toronto Zoo. We don't feed them in the winter because, as I said, their body basically shuts down. They don't need the food, they don't need the resources. They've built up that store of the resources in the fall, so they can just shut down in the winter. We typically don't feed them between November and April. We'll start feeding them again probably end of April, early May, depending on how warm it gets.
Mary would like to know, why do they lay on top of one another?
That's just a pile of turtles. That's how they go. Because these three live together, they're used to each other. They tolerate this pretty well. This is kind of their little family group here. Normally, when it comes to snapping turtles, they are very territorial. You generally won't see more than one in a setting. So if you say you have one under your dock at a cottage and it overwinters there, you're really only going to ever see that one. They come together for breeding, but they really don't like to be together beyond that. But these three have learned to get along. They love each other. You will always see Minimus in this side of the pool here. The girls, especially in the summertime, like to move around a lot.
Do you give the turtles a specific spot to sun themselves?
So they have all of the land that we have here in our beaver habitat. They are fully capable of climbing up there. But actually, snapping turtles aren't the biggest baskers when it comes to turtles. You very rarely see snapping turtles hanging out on a rock or out on a log, kind of soaking in that sun. Most of the time, what you'll see with them is they'll have part of their body out, like their head down to just their front legs. But they're not like a lot of other turtles that prefer to spend a lot of time out in the sun.
And do all the Canadian native turtles use the extra blood vessels to get through the winter?
The aquatic ones do, yeah. So all of our turtles that naturally live in the water, that is their way of surviving through the winter. We do have a turtle that is not technically a native turtle in Ontario, but has started building up enough numbers. The eastern box turtle is a land-dwelling turtle. It's technically a tortoise, actually. And they actually spend their winter in mud and just below the surface of the ground. And believe it or not, they can actually completely freeze. They don't have to stay above zero. They are capable of surviving below freezing temperatures.
Okay, so then we have, what is the closest relative to turtles?
Oh, wow. You're really testing my scientific knowledge here. Turtles are basically like they're their own group when it comes to reptiles. I would say if you look at the anatomy of a turtle and the way that a lot of their bone structures work and the way a lot of their facial structures work, personally, they more resemble birds. They do have beaks, their bones are very similar to birds, their organs function very similar to birds. But when it comes to reptiles, turtles do tend to be kind of on their own path there.
We actually have quite a few questions. Do they hibernate? So I guess you've kind of gone over
that.
So
that's basically what they're up to right now. In reptiles, we use the term brumate, not really hibernate. And they do truly hibernate. So to be considered truly hibernating, you have to completely shut down, basically be impossible to disturb out of that sleep. So something like a grizzly bear, for instance, doesn't truly hibernate because they do wake up every so often over the winter. But something like our turtles here definitely do.
Other than being painful, is there a problem with the snapper biting the human?
You're dealing with pain and probably some broken bones depending on where they get you. So that snap of theirs is very strong. But don't fret. If you are swimming around, you know you've got one by your cottage, say, they don't want to go after us. We're not food sources to them. You just don't disturb them. Don't be swimming under your dock and trying to poke them in the face. That's a good way to lose a finger. But if we recognize that these animals were here long before we were, we can just learn to live together. They do a great job in lakes and rivers of controlling a lot of the fish populations. They will also scavenge dead animals, so they're a part of that cleanup crew as well.
Do these particular turtles have babies?
These ones have not, no. So they have laid eggs before, but we do discard the eggs. When it comes to snapping turtles and any native turtle breeding program, the Ministry of Natural Resources has guidelines for breeding native turtles. You have to know their exact genetics, where they came from, because these three are rescue turtles, we don't have their genetic lineage, so they're not part of a captive breeding program, no.
Autumn, age 8, would like to know how big they grow.
So this is about full size for them. So our females here are about, that's their shell size here. Minimus, our male, he's a little bit bigger. He weighs about 25 pounds. Our females weigh about 15 pounds or so.
Yeah, I think we have a couple more. Can they scratch you with their claws?
Very much so. So one of the things that I always talk about when I'm talking about helping turtles across the road, and this goes for big snappers or little painted turtles, their nails can be very sharp. So personally, I like to always keep a set of work gloves in my car. So if I'm ever driving along and I need to help a turtle across the road, you've got that protection on your hands. But their nails are incredibly sharp, so definitely can hurt a little bit if you don't hold it the right way.
Okay, is there any type of enrichment that they have?
These guys, the best type of enrichment for them is just hanging out in the water, to be perfectly honest with you. Our female turtles love to climb up into our beaver lodge, actually, and they have little naps with our beavers. The beavers actually use them as pillows. It's a really cute thing to see, especially in the springtime. But really, with these guys, they're not the type of turtle that will do a lot of interacting with things. We are always expanding what we're trying to do with these animals. One of their favorite things to do actually is use the leftover logs that the beavers have left floating in the pool. You'll see them biting at them and chasing them and that. So they do kind of make their own fun.
We actually have a few people asking if they can get any sort of diseases that can affect people, I should say.
Yes, well, so there's not really any disease that's transmissible from turtle to human. There are bacteria, of course. You always got to watch out for things like salmonella when you're talking about turtles. But if they do have their own little disease, like for instance, they can have lung problems, they can have cancers and that, this type of hibernation or brumation is actually quite risky to them because their body temperature drops so low, they lose their ability to fight any kind of disease that they might have. So it does often result in turtles not making it through the winter, but it's because of that underlying disease that they did end up having.
Okay, we'll just do 2 more. Paula, age 45, would like to know if the water freezes on top.
So normally no, because we do have a filtration system that runs in this pool because we do have the fish in here, so we have to make sure it is kept with the chemicals balanced. So because we have a constant flow of water, the water does not freeze on the top. Actually, recently our filtration system needs a bit of repairs, so it wasn't running as well as it should, and it did freeze a little bit recently. But because our animals the turtles would be fine, but the beavers aren't accustomed to the ice, so we actually took big logs and smashed the ice just to make sure the beavers would be okay.
Okay, and we'll just do 1 more. How long can snapping turtles live?
So generally, they actually haven't done a lot of really good research on maximum longevity for a snapping turtle. They estimate anywhere from 40 to 50 years in a zoo setting. There have been rumors of snapping turtles living into their 70s and 80s, but there really isn't a great average for that. All right, folks, I want to thank you so much for joining us again at one of our lives here at the Toronto Zoo. Like I said, fingers crossed you can come visit us here again as soon as possible. But in the meantime, keep tuning in every day at 1 o'clock, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great day.